warm, bright evening in December, when most people are already at home, wrapped in blankets with cups of hot tea. Outside, the snow is falling, and there is absolute silence on the street. A typical winter evening. In a small house on a quiet street in the city center, Jack sits at the table. He is 23 years old, carefree and calm. Life goes on as usual, there's not much work, he has some friends, but he's not lonely. The night, like any other day, seems ordinary. Jack looks out the window at the snow-covered street, where snow is falling. All the cars are parked, and a few pedestrians are slipping on the snowy sidewalks. His gaze falls on the clock. It's almost 10 p.m. He closes his laptop, preparing for bed. But for a moment, his gaze lingers on something that seems out of place. He hears something. A faint sound, like a light knock, ominous and unclear, coming from the dark part of the house. Jack doesn't pay much attention at first, he thinks it's just the wind or maybe some noise from outside, but later, when the sound repeats, he starts to get nervous. He stands up and walks to the door. It's dark in the hallway, with only the dim light from the lamp on the table reflecting off the walls. He walks down the corridor, stopping by the bedroom door, and listens. Another knock. It sounds like someone is knocking on the wall from the other side. The sound doesn't stop, and Jack feels an increasing sense of unease. He opens the door and enters the dark room. Nothing. Just silence. Jack turns back to the window, then to the table, then to the door. He feels calmer and convinces himself that it's just his nerves. But what happens next makes him lose his composure. Jack suddenly turns around when he hears the living room door slam shut. He loses his guard and quickly rushes to the door, thinking it's just the wind bringing in the cold from the threshold. But what does he find? Nothing. The living room is empty again. He carefully closes the door and listens to the surroundings. Silence again, but this time, Jack starts to notice something unusual hanging over him. He tries to turn off the lamp, hoping to dispel the strange mood. But every movement and every sound seems 10 times louder to him. A few minutes later, as he sits back in his seat, his mind wakes up and asks, is it just his imagination, or is something really happening? And he hears it again, now clearly, footsteps. Not from the street, not from the basement, not from the neighboring house. These are footsteps in his own house. It could be anyone, but he knows for sure that no one was in the house before he closed the door. Jack is paralyzed with fear, his heart pounding in his chest. He decides to walk down the corridor, not knowing what to expect. He hears the footsteps getting closer. Suddenly, in one of the corners, he notices a shadow. Barely visible, but so distinct that it cannot be ignored. Jack freezes in place. The shadow disappears so quickly that he thinks his mind is playing tricks on him. But one thing is clear, something is not right here. Everything seems too strange, too different from usual. Jack tries to push these thoughts out of his head. Just don't start panicking, he whispers to himself, trying to convince himself that nothing serious has happened. He decides that the best thing to do is to check the basement. There shouldn't be anything scary there, right? He quietly descends the stairs, hiding in the darkness. But in the basement, everything looks as if someone had just left the place and forgotten to close the door. Jack tries not to pay attention to the feelings overwhelming him. But is it really him who, right after hearing a loud noise, starts running back upstairs, and footsteps echo on the stairs? Who is it? Jack quickly climbs the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest, and blood rushing to his head. The footsteps follow him, almost in sync with his movements, like a terrifying, sinister game. The corridor is deathly silent, but Jack feels his nerves crackling. He turns for a moment, only to see emptiness, absolutely nothing, but every step, every movement through the house is accompanied by the feeling that someone is behind him. A shadow. Just a shadow. And suddenly, he hears a soft rustling sound that seems to come from the room where he was earlier. Jack stands still, staring into the darkness. Could it be his imagination? No, it wasn't the sound of the wind or any outside noise. A rustle. Light, but persistent. Jack tries to control his breathing as he approaches the door. His hands are trembling, but he can't stop. He knows he must find an answer. As soon as he opens the door, he sees an empty space. However, under the bed, he notices something. Something that shouldn't be there. Something he can't explain. In the darkness, two pairs of eyes glimmer at him like candle reflections. These eyes are what Jack has been trying so desperately to see. What are these creatures? What are they doing in his house? He tries to step back, but those eyes follow him, as if they know everything. Jack can't take a step back. "Who are you?" he asks, his voice barely a whisper. And then, the feeling suddenly changes. The eyes disappear. The entire room fills with silence, so deafening it becomes almost unbearable. Jack is ready to believe that he's being haunted by ghosts, when he realizes that things are not that simple. In the background, behind the bed, a figure appears. Slowly, silently, it steps out from its hiding place. This is not just a shadow. It's a figure, tall and dark, with a human shape, but its contours are unclear. Its features are almost invisible, just a dark silhouette. Jack shudders, his breathing becomes erratic as the silhouette draws closer. And here, when he can no longer escape, he feels a cold breath on his neck and immediately realizes that he has only one goal: escape. He rushes for the exit, his legs not listening to him, his heart pounding out of his chest. Every movement is accompanied by the feeling that he is not alone. As soon as he reaches the door and opens it, he hears that soft knock again, echoing in the dark corridor. Jack stands still, unable to move further. Every movement feels threatening because he knows, this is not just a fantasy. This is reality, one he can no longer fight. And then he sees her. Real, not a phantom. The figure stands right before him. She has no face, but her posture, her movements make him feel every bit of pain and fear. And Jack begins to understand that he has fallen into a trap, one that he created himself. "Who are you?" He can't tear his eyes away from this creature's gaze. And again, quietly, almost without a trace, a new sound emerges from the darkness. A knock. Now it's clear and distinct. It's not a sound coming from the other side of the door. It's a sound from inside. He realizes that until this moment, he himself was the source. His own body was bound to this place, and he had become part of something greater. Nothing makes sense. Those who were once with him, just shadows, born from his own fear. His hands are cold, and he can't move. And suddenly, he feels his legs stop moving. Something drains his strength, and Jack understands that time is so close now that there's nothing he can do to change it. The shadow before him, within the shadow of the figure, grows to enormous proportions. And Jack understands, this is not just a ghost, it's his own past, returning to settle his fate. Now he sees his death, and it is no mystery. In the final moment before the darkness, when all feelings fade, he hears one more sound, a knock, but this time not from behind. A knock coming from himself. Jack stands in the darkness, facing the terrifying figure that consumes the entire space. His heart beats so loudly he can hear its thuds in his head. Every movement he makes is filled with fear, as he realizes, he cannot escape. But suddenly, something changes. The figure before him grows silent, and from the darkness that was only momentary, Jack hears his own voice. I don't. His words echo soundlessly, lost in the darkness that swallows everything. He slowly takes a step back, but feels his feet remain glued to the spot, as if an invisible force is holding them in place. A heavy silence envelops him. The figure, which seemed so invincible before, now fades into the darkness, leaving only an echo in the air. The whole room, the entire house suddenly seems ordinary. Just like before. Jack clenches his fists, trying once again to take another step. But at the same moment, as he attempts to move, he feels a strange pressure in his chest, as if something or someone is embracing him from all sides. What is this? He asks quietly, realizing that he can no longer be just a spectator. He turns. In the doorway leading to the hallway, now stands another figure. It is him, Jack, but in a completely different form, eyes filled with endless emptiness, a pale, grim face that only resembles a shadow. He realizes, this is his past, this is what he fears more than anything. And at the moment when he tries to understand what is happening, a tear in the space appears. The darkness dissipates, but instead of a clear world, Jack sees emptiness. Nothing has form, nothing exists anymore except for him. And here, he understands that he himself has become part of this world. Not the house, not the shadow, not the ominous figure, these were all parts of him. His fate had already been decided, and no one could change the outcome. All sounds, all movements, quieted. Jack became part of this dark place, and with each new knock, each breath, He understands, now he himself is the source of this darkness. And now, he stands amidst this emptiness that devours everything around him, remaining invisible to anyone who dares to approach. The only sound that echoes is his own heart, beating in the endless echo of the void. The remains of the house where Jack once lived now stand quietly and unnoticed amidst the snowdrifts. The street is empty, everything seems abandoned and forgotten. And only one fact leaves the viewer in contemplation: when looking at the house from the outside, over time, one can see small reflections in the windows, people who never managed to leave, those whom the shadow claimed. Who are they? And why can't they leave? A frosty evening. The first snowflakes fall to the ground, quietly crunching beneath his feet. The street is empty, with only a few lamplights flickering in the darkness, giving the city an ominous appearance. Fog slowly descends onto the asphalt, as if swallowing everything around. Against this unusual calm, the only sound that can be clearly heard is the crunch of snow beneath boots. James, a 46-year-old middle-aged man, is heading home after a long day at work. He stayed late at the office, lacking the energy to head back quickly. As usual, he decided to walk, a short stroll to clear his mind, to calm his nerves after meetings and phone calls. The street seems familiar and usual to him, but today, something feels off. He feels slightly exhausted, but decides not to pay attention. Everything around seems closed and empty, and the lamplights only emphasize the cold silence. Why is it so quiet? James thinks, stopping for a moment, scanning the street. There's no wind. No people. Indistinct sounds drift from the darkness. The usual calmness vanishes from his face. He listens, trying to figure out what it was. James continues walking, but now his steps are firmer, as if he's trying to leave this place as quickly as possible. His body is tense, and his gaze increasingly shifts toward the street lamps, which grow dimmer with every step. The further he walks, the more uncomfortable he feels. Suddenly, at the edge of his vision, beyond the snowbanks, a silhouette flashes. At first, James thinks it's just a play of light. Maybe it's just his imagination. But the silhouette moves. It pauses in place. He's stunned and feels a cold sweat on his forehead. Who's there? Is someone out on the street? He whispers, stopping and not believing his eyes. The silhouette approaches, becoming clearer, but it doesn't take on any form that would suggest a person. It's almost like another, dark figure that steadily moves closer, but despite the distance, it makes no sound. James feels his heart racing, his breathing becoming heavy. His hands involuntarily clench, and his legs hardly obey him. He tries to take a few steps back, but the fog seems to stop him. Maybe I'm just tired. He tries to reassure himself, but deep inside, a feeling wakes up: this is not just fatigue. The silhouette finally comes close enough, and in that moment, James feels a sharp cold wind. It's not just a breeze, it's as if a breath passed through him, piercing him to the bone. The silhouette becomes clearer and freezes, and in front of it, a black, shapeless shadow appears, shimmering with cold. He opens his mouth but can't make a sound. Chaos builds up in his mind. What is this? He rasps, unable to comprehend how to react. But what he saw before him even surprised his seasoned imagination. It was a person, faceless, only the dark impression of its figure. And then, a tearing sound. Sharp, piercing, like the jerk of something metallic. James looks around and sees more and more silhouettes emerging from the fog. They walk, silently, for reasons he cannot understand. Time stands still. He turns and quickly starts moving toward his house. Desperately, with a chill in his chest, he begins to run. What do they want? James asks himself, but he can't answer. James runs, his legs feeling heavier with each step. The snow constricts his movements, and his breathing is labored and raspy. He turns around, trying to understand whether there's anyone else nearby or if it's just his imagination. The silhouettes are still following him, slowly, like shadows, not changing their pace but clearly pursuing him. No, this can't be real. James tries to convince himself, quickening his steps. It feels like the whole world has become part of this nightmare. The street seems endless, his house still far ahead, but it never gets any closer. James can barely feel his body anymore, only the hungry emptiness that feels every second passing. The silhouettes turn out to be not ordinary people. They don't move naturally. Their figures look like people, but their bodies appear hollow, as if deprived of life, with foggy, unnatural movements. Dark shadows swirl around them like clothing, or something even more sinister. Every glance behind only intensifies the fear. His heart beats so fast, he feels like he might hear it from the outside. This is not just fear, it's an attempt to survive. James sharply turns the corner, only a few hundred meters from his house, but his strength fades. His legs feel impossible to move, as if something heavy presses against him with each step. I won't make it, his mind tries to organize the chaos, but the terror won't let him think clearly. For a moment, everything goes still. Was it a flash of hope, or just an illusion? James abruptly stops, hearing a strange sound, a barely audible whisper coming from the fog. The shadow that appeared before him approaches again. It was not a person, but rather an entity, blurry like a stream of black smoke, shifting and seemingly able to change its form. "You can't hide from me," he hears. The voice. It's not just a whisper. It's the cold reality speaking to his consciousness. He feels it filling his mind, and his own thoughts cease to be his. As James stands frozen in place, he watches as more figures emerge from the fog. They don't move toward him, but they create an air wall around him, cutting him off from any escape from this nightmare. His strength fades again, and he feels the cold pierce into his core, suffocating him. Images from his past appear in his mind: his father, whom he hasn't seen in years, a woman he loved and lost. These images become clearer, like figures overtaking his consciousness. Another dark figure appears from the fog. It stands in front of him, moving its lips. "Don't you remember us?" it whispers softly. And in that moment, when James starts to step back, the whole street suddenly seems to vibrate. He hears rustling sounds again from below. The air around him has become heavy, the fog tightly wraps around him, as if pressing him to the ground. James feels panic rising inside him, leaving no hope for salvation. The street that once seemed familiar and safe now feels like a trap. This is a trap. This is all a trap. His thoughts blur as the figures begin to gradually move toward him. He no longer tries to escape, his legs are no longer capable of moving, his body heavy and almost unconscious from fear. Each step, every movement of their shadows adds another stroke to his downfall. And when the figure that stood before him unveils its face, he suddenly understands, this is not just a vision. This is not just a nightmare. This is his past, his mistakes, his lost opportunities, which have now come alive and returned for him. And the worst part, he couldn't avoid what he had done. One of the silhouettes moves closer to him. "Do you think this will end when you return home?" The voice sounds like James's own, but it's not him. It's what was hidden in his heart, what he tried to forget. Suddenly, the ground beneath him begins to crack. The fog grows thicker. The steps draw closer, and eventually, when he can no longer fight, he understands, he himself has become part of this shadow, part of this night. In front of him opens a black, bottomless abyss, and he feels his whole world disappear, swallowing him into the darkness. The shadows of his past remain with him, and they will never let go. The darkness engulfs him. All sounds fade away. James no longer feels the cold or pain, only emptiness. The shadows recede, leaving him alone with the abyss. He doesn't know how much time has passed, minutes, hours, or eternity. Suddenly, he hears a voice. The same voice he heard before, but now it doesn't sound as terrifying. "You can't turn back time," the voice says calmly, like someone resigned to inevitability. James tries to open his eyes, hoping to find something familiar. And then, before him, a vision appears. He's back on the same street, but it looks completely different. The fog is gone, leaving only an empty space around him. The houses stand silently, their windows empty, no living soul in sight. He rises, trying to understand if he really has returned. But when he looks at his hands, his heart tightens with terror. He no longer feels alive. His body looks pale, like a wax figure standing on the edge between life and death. "They're still here," he quietly says to himself, looking around. The shadows that had pursued him now become part of this street, their figures spreading across the buildings like dark veils, covering every corner. James realizes he cannot leave this place. This is not just a nightmare, this is his new reality. He has become part of a street that no longer exists. A street that fades away but, at the same time, continues to exist in another form, as the lost souls. The shadows don't move closer, they simply remain near. They no longer chase him, they only observe. And here, he understands, he is no longer just a man. He is one of them, one of those who once wandered this street until they became part of it. Is this my end? He asks aloud, but there is no answer. Only the silence that will remain with him forever. Suddenly, the voice echoes in his head again. It is not a foreign voice, but his own, ominous, speaking as though foretelling his fate. You will never leave this place. You will always be here. And they will follow you. And with these words, the shadows surround him, slowly turning him into one of them, leaving James lost in this endless labyrinth where no escape exists. The darkness once again envelops the street, and if you look closely, you can see how another figure slowly disappears somewhere in the fog. Another traveler who tried to leave this place, but now has become part of it. The street waits.